Welcome to episode 111 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. At this point in our podcast, we've completed our first review of Lucretius's poem, and we've turned to the presentation of Epicurean ethics found in Cicero's On Ends. Today we complete the Torquatus material, and next week we'll be coming back to discuss Epicurus's letter to Herodotus. But for today, we complete the Torquatus section of Book 1 of Cicero's On Ends. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
Wherefore, if the doctrines I have stated are more dazzling and luminous than the sun itself, if they are draughts drawn from nature's spring, if our whole argument establishes its credit entirely by an appeal to our senses, that is to say, to witnesses who are untainted and unblemished, if speechless babies and even dumb beasts almost cry out that with nature for our governor and guide there is no good fortune but pleasure, no adverse fortune but pain, and their verdict upon these matters is neither perverted nor tainted, are we not bound to entertain the greatest gratitude for the man who, lending his ear to this voice of nature, as I may call it, grafted in so strong and serious a spirit that he guided all thoroughly sober-minded men into the track of a peaceful, quiet, restful, happy life? And though you think him ill-educated, the reason is that he had no education of any worth but such as promoted the ordered life of happiness. Was the man to spend his time in conning poets as I and Triarius do on your advice, when they afford no substantial benefit, and all the enjoyment they give is childish and kind? Or was he the man to waste himself, like Plato, upon music, geometry, mathematics, and astronomy, which not only start from false assumptions, and so cannot be true, but if they were true, would not aid us one whit towards living a more agreeable, that is a better life? Was he, I ask, the man to pursue those arts and thrust behind him the art of living, an art of such moment, so laborious too, and correspondingly rich in fruit? Epicurus then is not uneducated, but those persons are uninstructed who think that subjects which it is disgraceful to a boy not to have learned are to be learned through life into old age.
Martin, thank you for reading that. That's the Reed translation of the final sections of Torquatus. We've been reading the Reed translation all the way through so far, but because these are the final two paragraphs, and these are particularly important summary paragraphs, Joshua's going to read the Rackham translation, which is really the version that most people run into when they find this on the internet. So Joshua, if you could read the Rackham.
If then the doctrine I have set forth is clearer and more luminous than daylight itself, if it is derived entirely from nature's source, if my whole discourse relies throughout for confirmation on the unbiased and unimpeachable evidence of the senses, if lisping infants, nay, even dumb animals, prompted by nature's teaching, almost find voice to proclaim that there is no welfare but pleasure, no hardship but pain, and their judgment in these matters is neither sophisticated nor biased, ought we not to feel the greatest gratitude to him who caught this utterance of nature's voice and grasped its import so firmly and so fully that he has guided all sane-minded men into the paths of peace and happiness, calmness and repose? You are pleased to think him uneducated. The reason is that he refused to consider any education worth the name that did not help to school us in happiness. Was he to spend his time, as you encourage Triarius and me to do, in perusing poets who give us nothing solid and useful, but merely childish amusement? Was he to occupy himself like Plato with music and geometry, arithmetic and astronomy, which, starting from false premises, cannot be true, and which, moreover, if they were true, would contribute nothing to make our lives pleasanter and therefore better? Was he, I say, to study arts like these and neglect the master art so difficult and correspondingly so fruitful, the art of living? No, Epicurus was not uneducated. The real Philistines are those who ask us to go on studying till old age the subjects that we ought to be ashamed not to have learned in boyhood.
Okay, thank you very much again, Joshua, for reading what you've read there in the Rackham translation. We are now at the end of our examination of the Torquatus narrative of On N's Book 1. The material is going to continue on as Cicero replies, and there's a whole lot more that we're not going to try to cover in this part of our podcast. But we've covered basically the ethics section, just as Torquatus said he was going to do. We've talked about the greatest good issue, the issue of whether virtue is truly the end of life. And then more recently, he's touched on the issues of physics and natural science and even a little bit of epistemology. And then most recently, over the last several weeks, we discussed the issue of friendship, potentially as a means of testing whether we really are going to be rigorously considering pleasure the end of life or not. And then before Torquatus ends his presentation to Cicero, he finishes with these two paragraphs today, which basically I think you could summarize as emphasizing the significance of Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy. And I think he does it in a very poetic way. So we read not only the Reed translation, which potentially is a little bit more literal to the Latin, but also the Rackham translation, which is slightly smoother in the English and probably conveys the sense of appreciation even better than Reed does. So if we start with the first line of the text, if then the doctrine I've set forth is clearer and more luminous than daylight itself, and if it's derived entirely from nature's source, and if it relies throughout for confirmation on the unbiased and unimpeachable evidence of the senses. This whole paragraph is talking about basically evidence issues, but any thought?
To be honest here, in this paragraph 21, I see a lot of parallels to the opening hymn to Venus in Lucretius's poem, because in Lucretius's poem, you have one of my favorite lines in the entire poem that says something to the effect of, "For you laugh the waves of the sea, and the calm heavens shine with shoreless light." And so you've got that little bit about the daylight in there. Here speaking about the doctrine itself, which is clearer and more luminous than daylight itself, derived entirely from nature's sources. And as we go through, you get to, just as in the hymn to Venus, the animals themselves and their behavior are evidence of the truth. Lucretius thinks he's saying, and what Torquatus here believes to be true as well. And then, of course, almost at the end of the hymn to Venus and starting into the next section, you've got that long sort of praise of Epicurus, who, what's the phrase I'm looking for? He sort of rent the tight-barred gates of nature's hold asunder or something.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Yeah.
He smashed the gates that separated us from nature, I believe is what it says there. Yes.
And then he climbed the flaming ramparts of the world and
brought back that information to us, which is the way by which we ascend to the heavens equal to the gods.
Right.
I remember how that goes. Yeah.
Yeah, and specifically there's a line in there where he says, "and brought back news of what can be and what cannot."
Yes.
What he's talking about here is what is our evidence of what can be and what cannot. And so what he says directly here is that what he's relying on is confirmation from the unbiased and unimpeachable evidence of the senses. That seems to be the ground that Torquatus is building his structure on. He goes on to illustrate that point by saying that even infants and dumb animals, prompted by nature's teaching, almost find voice themselves to proclaim that there is no welfare but pleasure and no hardship but pain. And this is full circle for us, because at the very beginning, we had a long, protracted argument in the Torquatus material here. I think our first episode on the Torquatus material about how we can infer from the behavior of an infant what the goal of life is. And so we're brought right back around to where we started.
Martin, before I jump back in, any thoughts so far?
No.
I'm finding it difficult to figure where to jump in and divide this up, because there's so many different but important issues here. Let me just list a couple, or just in sequence as I see them. There's that first issue about the evidence coming from observation of nature, and that evidence is more clear, more luminous than daylight itself. And so you've got that evidence issue. And then you have the point that there is no welfare but pleasure, no hardship but pain. So we've spent a lot of time with that, like you were saying, Joshua. Reed calls that no good fortune but pleasure, no adverse fortune. So there's all the issues that are wrapped up into whether there's any good but pleasure or any evil but pain. And then there's when he says that the judgment in these matters is neither sophisticated nor biased. We almost have a reflection of the discussion of the senses where they are pre-rational. That's the all sensations are true almost issue, or at least as an analogy there, because they're not sophisticated or biased. Biased, I guess, the opinion aspect. And then there is, go ahead, Joshua.
Well, the other side to the symmetry on that point is in the second paragraph. He's going to go in to talk about here, like Plato, occupying yourself with music and geometry and arithmetic and astronomy, all of which are sophisticated pursuits and all of which are, or at least particularly for Plato, were bent to his philosophical will. So they were biased in that way.
Yes.
So nature's teaching, which the animals and the infants themselves almost find voice to express, are neither sophisticated nor biased. That's the foundation that Epicurus builds his ethics on.
So there, Joshua, you've just raised in my mind that these two we've got is 71 and 72. They're almost parallel to each other, in 71 being a praise of Epicurus and 72 being an indictment of Plato and the Platonists and the people who are aligned with them. So there's that parallelism, I would say, is out. And you know, Joshua, I'm going to fall back further. We discussed last week how it was interesting that we were ending on friendship and how a difficult issue maybe, and how Lucretius had ended on the plague of Athens, which was the difficult issue. We talk about how Cicero had in front of him these other books apparently about Epicurus, but didn't Cicero also read Lucretius? Because isn't that the reference that he had read it and commented on it to his brother? So do we know that Lucretius himself was not in front of Cicero when he was writing this material?
Yeah, we do know that he read Lucretius. He actually, I think we have that note to his brother, or maybe we just have a reference to it in a different work, where he says that the poet Lucretius is full of great genius, but also great art, or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. It would be impossible, I think, to say whether he read that before or after he wrote this.
Yeah, I guess we don't know specific dates. We probably have a better idea of when this was written than we do when he got a copy of Lucretius's book. But a lot of this was going on right near the end of his life during the war period. There wouldn't have been a lot of time difference no matter what. So I don't know that he's quoting Lucretius ever anywhere, but I do agree with you that there's a lot of echoes. Or, of course, could be that Lucretius also himself is echoing other writers that had been developed in the intervening period as well, too. So no telling where all these things come from, but there is a lot of reflection and parallel in a lot of this material. And the other thing that I wanted to list is something that was in that first section. Of course, there's the feel the greatest gratitude to him who caught this utterance of nature's voice. So the accusation about whether Epicurean philosophy is a cult, whether the Epicurean movement was a cult and so forth, I would say that this is the best reflection of the proper attitude towards Epicurus, is that we feel great gratitude to him, not necessarily, of course, that we worship him. And then grasp its import so firmly and fully that he guided all sane-minded men into the paths of peace and happiness, calmness and repose. So, yeah, there's lots you could talk about from those words too. But before we move on to the second section, it seems like to me that here in his summary of praising Epicurus, he's choosing to emphasize that Epicurus's positions are basically things that he's observed from nature. We've had some discussions recently on the forum that caused this thought to come to my mind. I generally don't see Epicurus saying ever, do this or don't do that very often. He lays the foundation for what he is teaching by giving the evidence to support it. And then from that evidence, it's pretty easy to conclude what things make sense and what things don't. He gives advice about whether to marry or whether not to marry, advice about whether to pursue fame and not to pursue fame, and all sorts of things that he gives advice on. But all the advice, it's not based on authority. He doesn't say, do this because I say so. He's not providing a 10 Commandments analogy where I'm God and I'm telling you what to do. He always provides the basis for his reasoning. And I see that going on here too. He's really not even saying here that Epicurus is the source of this information. He's saying that it's the dumb animals and your observation of nature that would allow pretty much anybody who's able to grasp its import so firmly and fully that you can see the same thing. But I see that as an important aspect to this.
Right. And what's that advice he gave to that lovesick boy whose name I can't think of? It's something like,
go ahead and pursue it if you can also do X, Y, and Z. Go ahead.
Yeah. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, more like it. But but then he goes into the reasons why you're going to have pitfalls at each stage.
I cut you off if you're able to remember any of those pitfalls from listing them. But yes, that's a great example of what I'm just saying. He's saying go ahead and do it so long as you can do it without A, B, C, D, E, and F, and G causing you all these problems, which, of course, as you read through them, you realize they are going to cause these problems. But he never just says, don't do it because I say so. Don't do it because God says so. Don't do it because it violates some rule of virtue.
Yeah, I have to give Cicero a lot of credit here at the end because this is really, I think stylistically, this is really beautiful language. I know you were keen to get to this one because it's such a fine example of Epicurean prose coming from Torquatus through Cicero. I'm just looking at the two translations side by side and noticing differences, but they're both well done.
Yes, I just don't have any issue here with the Rackham version. Sometimes I think Reed gives more detail that's helpful to understand some subtlety, but in this final set of paragraphs, I think Rackham has captured it extremely well. Maybe it does make sense. Let's go ahead and just read the details of the second paragraph too, because everything we're discussing today is sort of related to each other. It's not like he picks up another topic as a whole. And so if indeed there's any truth to say that the first paragraph is praise of Epicurus and the second paragraph is sort of praise of him by indicting Plato, he starts to deal with these accusations against Epicurus. You are pleased to think him uneducated. And the reason that is that he refused to consider any education worth the name that did not help to school us in happiness. So that's a reference to a series of statements that are out there in the text about set sail from all culture, something like that is one of them. Joshua and Martin, do y'all remember other references that flee from, it's something about set sail or flee from culture is one of them that's thrown out there regularly.
Right, and the distrust of poetry in particular.
Yes.
Because of poets and their tendency to lie, particularly about the gods and the supernatural. I think that Norman DeWitt did a really good job on this question of whether Epicurus was educated or not. And he comes down firmly on the conclusion that not only was Epicurus very widely educated, he was really going to the trouble of surveying the whole field. You know, he wanted to know what the Cynics thought. He wanted to know what Plato thought. He wanted to know how Aristotle had adapted Plato's thinking. He wanted to know what Pyrrho was thinking and what he learned when he came back from India. So there was a real thirst to understand what the claims that were made by the other philosophers. So there was, I guess that's education of a kind, isn't it? That doesn't get into
yes
of music and geometry and arithmetic and all that. But certainly when it came to philosophy, there was a real desire to understand all of the arguments before he settled on just one. And that's why the whole issue of chaos was sort of his launching, right? His instructor couldn't explain chaos. And so, you know, I think most students in that situation would just sort of move on with their lives. But Epicurus not only came up with an explanation that would get around the chaos issue, but he built an entire philosophy to explain life, the universe, and everything.
Yes. Which was your reference last week to what is the name of that book?
The Hitchhiker's Guide.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, yes. You know, I got two comments to make. One of them when you referred to the DeWitt argument as well. I think I remember also that DeWitt points out that what he was reacting to in terms of opposing education was the issue of the general goal of the Platonic teaching, the different way that students were taught in Athens at that time. The purpose was to raise a good citizen. I mean, I guess that's what the Republic of Plato is largely about, is how you create a good state. And so there's a number of references that traditional education that he was opposed to, the reason he was opposed to it is because its purpose was not to raise a happy person, but to raise a good citizen for Athens, potentially a soldier and a statesman, and that the goal of his education was very different. I know I found in the Diogenes Laertius, it's around line 6 apparently, Again, in the letter to Pythocles, they say he wrote, quote, "Blessed youth, set sail in your bark and flee from every form of culture." And then there's a couple of other similar references in there as well about that and his antipathy towards certain types of education. And he's not opposing all education. He's got specific things against. And that's basically what this says, because he continues on and says that what essentially Plato is encouraging them to do is to peruse the poets who give us nothing solid and useful but childish amusement, and then to occupy himself like Plato with music and geometry, arithmetic and astronomy. Now, the next phrase is one that we've talked about several times with Martin, so maybe we'll hold off on that. But again, what was supposed to be over the gate of the Academy of Plato? Something about don't enter here unless you know, what is it, geometry?
Yeah, because the belief that Plato had was that by studying Euclid and the way he used axioms and sort of logic to prove his geometric theorems, that by analogy, that was the way that you should progress in philosophy, which of course Epicurus had no time for that idea. But
yes. And you, I think, know Pythagoreans better than I do, but they were also based in sort of a numerology approach or something that was very intricate.
Yeah. I've mentioned many times before their idea that 10 was the perfect number. And because 10 was the perfect number, that had to be, whether it was true to the senses or not, it had to be the case that 10 was the number of celestial spheres, on which the planets and stars were tacked, or however that worked. But because his argument for why 10 is the perfect number, was that if you have 1, that makes a point. If you have 2, that makes a line. If you have 3, that makes a surface. And if you have 4, it's a solid. And if you add up all of those, you get to 10. That's why 10 is the perfect number.
And of course, when you've said that last time, I followed up with my interrogation. Why do we instinctively know that that is a wrong method of analysis? And that's probably still a question that's worth asking. I don't know if you have any different answer today, but I think that's clearly the direction is we know that that's not a good method of reasoning, but that's what they were essentially recommending to some degree. I've taken it out of order. It looks like the first thing in the list was he to spend his time, as you encouraged Travis and me to do, in perusing poets, which give us nothing solid and useful but childish amusement. Now, in trying to remember what DeWitt has said about that section or that issue, do we think that's mostly a reference to Homer, or what do you think about that, Joshua, especially since you're into the poetry aspect of it? I know that Homer was held in extremely high regard.
He certainly was. Homer was the foundation of, Greek culture, Greek education. Absolutely universal among Greeks would have been some knowledge of Homer, or at least, what the mythology behind the Trojan War and what that was all about. But the other side of that is Lucian of Samosata and his true story, which he prefaces by saying that this is a true story because I'm the only one to admit that it's a whole pack of lies. So that's the problem. I think that Epicurus, and you can find this in DeWitt as well, he was proficient in his understanding of Homer, and sufficiently proficient that he could actually use references to justify his own position. But there is a problem with poetry in Epicurus' view, although I think even that has become somewhat a controversial position, because what they've unearthed in Herculaneum from Philodemus suggests not only an affinity for poetry, but a deep understanding and sort of a unique critical approach to understanding poetry.
And I guess that's the reference in Diogenes Laertius, that the wise man isn't going to compose it, but is going to be the only one who can really criticize it properly.
Right, but Philodemus did both. In fact, he was known as a poet and an epigram writer before Herculaneum, before that whole thing was found. And they found all his other works, or fragments of them.
Maybe one day we need a special episode or a special program on Philodemus's poetry, because if I remember correctly, some of it's pretty, I don't know if it's risque or whatever, but it's kind of wild, if I understand correctly. It's not like Lucretius' serious philosophic poetry, or is it? Have you read any of it, Joshua?
Yeah, I've read a little bit of it.
It's a love poetry or something, right?
It is. And the thing you kind of have to situate it in the context of what they originally knew him from, like I said, was the Greek anthology. And the Greek anthology, which is translated to anthology, literally means garland of flowers. And so this is not serious work generally on the whole. There are funeral epitaphs and stuff like that, but for the most part, this is like sort of bawdy, humorous. You might think of it as limericks almost.
I don't know whether if somebody were pursuing some more reading on Epicurus and the Epicureans' attitude towards romantic love, do you know enough about Philodemus to know whether that material is pro-romantic love, or is it not cynical, not the right word, but is it all just for fun, or is it?
I wouldn't know the answer to that. I actually recently picked up a book called The Good Poem According to Philodemus, but I haven't gotten very far.
I would think that the major issue in criticizing Homer would be the issue of the gods being involved in all of this history in ways that would be totally un-Epicurean, taking sides and falling in love with human women and doing all sorts of things with humans. I presume that that's probably, if you had to list the reasons why they are considering it to be childish amusement, would that be near the top of the list, or do you think it's something else?
Yeah, certainly the gods of Homer are completely contrary to Epicurus' conception of the gods. He does not view them as having, well, first of all, any interest in the human species at all. That's the important. But also they're supposed to be devoid of all these human faults like lust and envy and jealousy and anger, and they don't have any experience of that because they live in perfect bliss. So I think that's probably a big part of it.
Yeah, in fact, I guess trying to drill down to the ultimate conclusion here, I don't know that he, some people might react negatively to thinking that he's criticizing poetry or criticizing painting or other artistic issues like that. But I think it's pretty clear that he's picking out particular types or particular messages that's in certain types of poetry and art as the real focus of his issue. When he says childish amusement here, I don't know whether there was a lot of children's poetry being written in ancient Greece or not, but I think it's probably more directed at just the improper attitudes towards religion that most of the Greek poetry would have included. And then, Martin, this is time to bring you back in again, because this is one of the sentences we've talked about in the past. Was he to occupy himself like Plato with music and geometry, arithmetic and astronomy, which starting from false premises cannot be true, and which moreover, if they were true, would contribute nothing to make our lives pleasanter and therefore better? What do you make of that sentence? Or what's the... I was almost, before you said that, I was going to jump in and say, how would you most constructively interpret that sentence?
I mean, of course, it's not completely wrong. The wrong part in it, and it is just that it gets the logic very wrong. And I'm not sure about whether this is a cunning trick of Cicero to have there a very obvious mistake with logic written there, so that I'm not sure whether he resumes it later and then really harps on it, or whether he let it just stand that anyone knowing logic would immediately see that this position there, which is assigned to the Epicureans, is wrong. I mean, like we discussed extensively about half a year ago, no? So if you start from false assumptions, by chance you can still can come to conclusions which are true. So you cannot say that they cannot be true. So it may still be true. It may be unlikely, or it's often not the case, but they can be true. And so that is the part which is wrong there. Huh? Then as written there shortly with music, geometry, mathematics, and astronomy, that one is probably not really the position, but rather the way these things are interpreted wrongly. No? So that geometry is interpreted to mean more than it actually is, and that the mathematics is thought as something telling truth about the world, which it doesn't. Huh? And astronomy then also was, in Plato's approach, something where he did start with the wrong assumptions on this, apparently. And in music, it's not music itself, but it's rather Plato's analysis of music where things go wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense to me when you explain it that way. Joshua, how would you attack that? What's the constructive central message being presented here in this passage?
I think Martin has kind of hit the nail on the head, and it's most obvious with this issue of geometry, in my view. Actually, it's almost as obvious with the issue of astronomy. But it's just what I was talking about before. You have, the word Martin used was interpretation. It's not geometry itself that is worthless. It's the interpretation that they impose on geometry that leads them down the wrong path. I'll give you an example. Here's a little story for you.
Okay.
Epicurus was born on the island of Samos, right? And long before he was born, there was this king whose name I can't think of. Polycrates, that was his name. And he wanted to fortify the island, or at least the main city on the island, because it has this really lovely natural harbor, which gave great protection to his ships. But the problem was that the spring water that fed the city was on the other side of this mountain. And he knew that if he were to wall off the city, all they would have to do would be to just dump poison or whatever into the spring water, or to change its flow, and they could just basically starve the city out by drought under sea. And so he comes up with a solution. He hires a geometer named Eupalinos, who decides that the way to solve this problem is to actually dig a tunnel through the heart of the mountain at a constant grade, so that starting at the spring water on, let's pretend, the north side of Samos, you can deliver water to the city just sort of like by an aqueduct to the south side of Samos. And so it took him like 10 years, but he had 2 crews on each side of the tunnel digging around the clock by torchlight for 10 years until they finally met in the middle. And they were able to meet in the middle because Eupalinos was really good at what he did. And it was geometry that allowed him to know that he was going to connect those 2 ends in the middle. And the result was that the city had a constant supply of fresh spring water. So I don't think that Epicurus would call fresh spring water to support a city, a worthless pursuit, right?
Right.
Certainly that is conducive to like health and happiness. Nobody wants to drink seawater or stagnant standing water. You want fresh running spring water flowing into your city. The kind of thing that you wouldn't have anywhere else until Rome developed its aqueduct system. So this was a huge development. This is actually considered to be one of the greatest engineering products or projects of the ancient world. And because Epicurus grew up on Samos and probably very likely drank water from that spring through that tunnel, it's certain that he would have known about that tunnel. This was a legendary engineering project for the time and for that place. So that's the kind of thing that you can do with geometry and mathematics and not base it on false assumptions and not lead to wrong premises and come up with something in the end that's good and, or I guess conducive to health and human happiness.
Practical is a word that jumps out at me. It's a practical application of these sciences. We've hit pretty hard over the weeks and months on the issue of the logic aspect of it, where Martin has been pointing out the issue of false assumptions and ending up with something that's true. But we can probably profitably spend a few more minutes on the other 2 examples here. Music in particular is not something you would normally think about as starting from a false presumption and not being true. What do we think he's talking about here in including music in this list? Because lots of people think that music is, I don't think it'd be controversial to say that music is a pleasure. Music is very pleasurable, or at least it can be. Why is music included in this list?
Because Plato made a theory of music which was wrong, apparently.
Great answer that I would not have been able to come up with myself, and I'm not able to elaborate on that. But I guess is that the harmony of the spheres issue?
That's what I was
something like that. Something like that. Plus, Plato even wanted to prescribe what is instead of just going through the senses, what music we like or not. He wanted to prescribe what music has to be pleasurable and other music is not pleasurable, just based on his on a theoretical concept.
I did not expect you to come up with this answer, Martin, so I'm very pleased to hear that you have that. Is that in the Republic, or do you know where that is found, or do you have any other detail on that?
No, I don't have this as hand, but I'm pretty sure I read something to that end, and in this context it makes sense. So to refer to that nonsensical theory of Plato and music.
I do think that occurs in Lucretius, a reference to that being a negative issue as well. I guess what I'm remembering is harmony. I remember that there's a section in Lucretius that attacks this issue or theory of harmony as being an explanation for certain things. And I'm tempted to think that issues regarding that word harmony are tied up in music. Joshua, do you have any more on that?
Well, I would come at it. Well, first of all, I agree with with the direction Martin's going. And I would have said something to the effect of the music of the spheres being somewhere near the root of the problem. But there's another way you can look at this, and I'm thinking of that HBO series Rome. I assume, Cassius, you will have seen that.
I've seen parts of it only.
Oh, okay. Well, there's this scene in the movie where Caesar and his army have crossed the Rubicon, and they're marching on Rome. And as the camera kind of follows along with, him and his army marching, and the band is right behind him, and he turns to the leader of the band and he said, "Can you play something more cheerful?" Right? Because it's sort of, you're invading Rome on a very ominous note. And he said, can we just be a little happier about this? Or something to that effect. So there is an element there of the use of music in, whether it's in the army or in temples or in these mystery cults or even in drama. There's a use of music for this kind of emotional manipulation to sort of persuade the audience or the soldiers, or the people who are visiting your temple. Maybe you want them to give you a little more money, a couple extra drachmas. And so the use of music for that purpose, I could see being one reason why he might be critical of it. Because it's not the case that every boy in Athens had, an iPhone or an iPod, right?
Right.
To just listen to music whenever they wanted. It was, very often state sponsored, or you'd have to go to the theater. They probably had music in the arena, the Coliseum, or in at the Olympic Games, that kind of thing. So there's an element of the use of music there that I could see being a problem, but I don't have any citation for that.
Well, now that we're talking about it, I do think that would be a key to unraveling a lot of this section here. I don't think anybody could credibly set out and prove that Epicurus was against all music, because I'm sure there are passages where he is endorsing, if I remember correctly, dancing, and I think that probably specific inclusion of music at some places. So a lot of us don't have much of a grasp of geometry and mathematics at all to even understand where that might be going. But clearly with music, Epicurus would have endorsed music in certain contexts or for certain uses or in certain situations. So he's not just saying that he's not just blanketly condemning music. And if that perspective applies to everything else in this list, then he's not certainly condemning all geometry, mathematics, and astronomy either. He's condemning something specific about them that it's up to us to understand what it is he's attacking. I mean, this letter to Pythocles is essentially a discussion of celestial bodies, which would be this issue of astronomy probably. Now, of course, maybe if you go back and dig behind the Latin, maybe they're actually talking about astrology. I don't know if anybody would suggest that or not. Astrology would be easier for someone like Epicurus to condemn. And in fact, I think there are other texts in divination, or at least, I don't know if you guys remember what I'm talking about there, but there's some text to the effect that even if it were true, you wouldn't want to use it or something like that. Do either of you remember a reference to astrology or divination?
No, I can't think of it off the top of my head.
Okay, so there's that's out there. But I mean, I guess this whole list here is something you just have to not take at face value that he's attacking every aspect. As it says here at the end of the sentence, don't aid us towards living a more agreeable and better life.
And if you go to the next sentence, studying arts like these will preoccupy you so that you neglect the master art, so difficult and correspondingly so fruitful, the art of living.
Yes.
So that's the problem, is that there's an impediment here
Yes.
to what the goal really is and how you might pursue it.
You know, we haven't reached that point in a few days in Athens, and I don't know whether either of you can remind me of the name of the geometer or the mathematician who converted into becoming an Epicurean, and they accused Epicurus of diverting him away from his expertise. Is that starts with a P, I think, but I never get his.
It does. It's Polyaenus.
Polyaenus. Okay. Yeah. Do you remember the story enough to comment on it, Joshua? What's the detail there?
Oh yeah, I just remember some vague hint that when he joined Epicurean philosophy, he sort of abandoned geometry and mathematics. But then I've also seen where that wasn't the case.
Yeah,
he did continue to write on these subjects.
I don't know whether I guess it's Diogenes Laertius, but I know that Frances Wright includes that specifically in her A Few Days in Athens. And she argues I don't know whether she has any grounds for it or not, but she argues that instead of telling him that he was wasting his time, Epicurus was simply pointing out to him that your real need in life is to understand the goal of happiness and pleasure. And you need to devote some time to doing that rather than spending all your time calculate. It's hard for me to argue that that's the wrong position.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would have to go to much effort to argue me out of calculating. It's not something I enjoy doing in the first place. So
there are certain people who enjoy that. Martin is probably the closest of the three of us to that.
Yeah.
Martin, do you have mathematics games that you play, or there's certain?
I used to do it. Now no more.
I remember when I was younger, a friend of mine found some book about magic squares or something like that, where you put numbers in a square that add up the same in all directions or something like that. And we found some great fun for a while working on that. But that's about
I used to do that too. I used to do that too. And I started making bigger and bigger ones. It took a very long time to get these bigger ones solved.
So is that what it's called, magic squares? And is that correct that you add them up in they're different numbers, but when you add them in different directions, they add to the same thing, something like that?
Yeah, yes, it's like that. I don't know what the English name for that one is, and I also forgot how we would name it in German, because this one was when I was at school that I would do this for fun, and later no more. So
we just used.
You used what, Joshua?
We just used the Japanese name, which is Sudoku, if that's what you're talking about.
Well, I've never understood what Sudoku is. Does Sudoku involve numbers?
Yeah. You've got 9 squares arranged in a grid, and then every square will have all the numbers between 1 and 10, and every line will have all the numbers between 1 and 10.
And what is the goal you're supposed to do? You're supposed to align them so that they do what?
Well, when you go into Sudoku, on the easier ones, they'll give you a lot of the numbers already filled in, and you have to figure out what the other numbers are. And then as it gets harder, they start giving you fewer and fewer numbers. And so there's a lot more possibilities, but there's only one right answer.
Okay. And of course, you've got an analogy might be Rubik's Cube. I guess that's kind of a similar issue. And this is stretching to even make a point here. But the point being is that you can certainly find even me can find some enjoyment in arithmetic or geometry for the sake of itself. But that's a diversion if you haven't got your life in order, sort of.
Right.
And what about the last sentence there, Joshua, my favorite one?
He says, no, Epicurus was not uneducated. No. The real Philistines are those who ask us to go on studying till old age the subjects that we ought to be ashamed not to have learnt in boyhood.
So what do you say to somebody who says that Epicurean philosophy is only for I started to say the rich and famous, but what I should say is the educated and high class and people with lots of leisure time on their hands who have all sorts of time to read all these details? Is Epicurean philosophy something that is reserved for the intellectual elite?
Well, you kind of put me in a bad position there, because while I do think that to really study Epicurean philosophy, you do have to put in the time to actually read it. No, this is not something that's restricted for Plato's, golden men or even his silver men. You can be a bronze man and still read this and still get all of the use out of it that there is to get out of it. And
not bronze men.
What was that?
I think the lower ones were iron, not bronze.
Oh, you're probably right about that. I get confused because in the Iliad, it was composed over so long a period of time that in some passages, iron is like this really rare, valuable metal, and in other passages, it doesn't seem to be rare and valuable at all. It's just the nature of this long age over which it was composed.
And the gold being at the top, was there silver as well? Was it gold, silver, bronze, and iron, or was there more than that?
Gold, silver, and iron.
Gold, silver, and iron. Well, the analogy there to all of this being that you don't have to be a golden. Proper philosophy isn't reserved for only the best people, only the smartest people. But, there's a statement that not everybody is capable of reasoning everything out that needs to be reasoned out. But in most cases, people are. And this is an affirmative statement that we ought to be learning this in childhood and not have to just go on to old age before we finally figure these things out.
Right. Yeah. The language, or I guess the term that I would use in sort of everyday speech would be golden child. You ever hear that one?
Yeah.
He's a golden child. You don't have to be a golden child to be an Epicurean.
Yes. And I'm looking at the different comparisons. I'm comparing the two translations. The word Philistine that Rackham is using, I presume, is not in the original Latin. I presume that's sort of an artifact of a biblical reference that probably Cicero would not have been incorporating. And if Reed is more literal, he's really turning it on the issue of whether they're uneducated and uninstructed. And now Reed throws in the term disgraceful not to have learned. So maybe this Philistine reference comes from whatever is in the Latin to prompt the disgraceful.
Could well be the case. There's two other words in here. One of them we talked about. This is in the Reed translation. Before we started recording, that was the word drafts. And I have a really great source. This is one of the best poems in the English language. And it comes to us by John Keats. And I'm only going to read one stanza. So this is the second stanza of Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and provincial song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. So if you are a consumer of wine, as I am, that is a really great passage. Keep your finger on. But of course, in the Torquatus material, the drafts we're drinking are not wine. They are drafts drawn from nature's spring.
You know what you're inspiring me sort of to think here, Joshua, is, okay, just like last week, I came to enjoy the potential thought that friendship was being used as a test case, sort of like the Plague of Athens in Lucretius. He's summarizing his argument in favor of pleasure as the goal, not with a logical summation, not with any kind of an intricate formula, but he's gone back to the person of Epicurus and our feeling of gratitude for what he accomplished. And there might be something significant in that here too, is that ultimately Epicurean philosophy isn't based on, it is based on observation, and it's based on a view of physics and so forth. But why are you doing it all? You come to the conclusion that you're doing it for the feeling of pleasure, and feeling is the issue. All the words in the world don't and cannot evoke in you a feeling of gratitude, like visualizing the person who you experience pleasure with, who's caused you to live this experience of pleasure that you would not have been able to do without them. So you already made the comment, Joshua, that this is kind of almost a poetic summary. And I think that's all the different things we talked about today are true. And in addition, it's true that the reason and ultimately the justification for it all is not a logical proof. It's a gut level emotional reaction to the sensation of pleasure that you get in dealing with life in a certain way. So,
Cassius, as I think about this, I think about the idea you've got this sort of gratitude for Epicurus in Lucretius. You've got it in Lucian of Samosata. You've got it in the Torquatus here. This kind of brings up the question for me: how do other philosophers, when they're describing, Zeno the Stoic, how do they describe him? I'd be very curious to see.
I don't know the answer to that, but one thing that jumps to my mind is the issue of the death of Socrates in one of, I forget what book it's included in Plato, but I don't know that people hold up Socrates' life as something to show gratitude to. They hold up Socrates as a paragon of wisdom or virtue and somebody to admire, but not to feel gratitude. If you were doing a Norman DeWitt analogy to Christianity, you might say that, okay, we feel gratitude to Jesus Christ from that religious perspective. But as far as gratitude goes, I wouldn't think that that's that big a part of the attitude you have towards. Do you think of who you want to suggest as another alternative, Nietzsche or somebody else? of all the emotions that those guys evoke, gratitude is not really it. I don't really think of them as being appreciative to them.
Right.
On a positive note, I'm not clear about the last sentence, actually. So what is it what the boy should have learned? Is it the portion of philosophy is important according to Epicurus, or is it these useless things like mathematics and geometry?
Joshua, what do you think?
Well, I think Martin is going very clearly in the right direction here, because what he says, to use the Rackham translation, even with some caution around that word Philistine or Philistine, the real Philistines are those who ask us to go on studying till old age the subjects that we ought to be ashamed not to have learned in boyhood. So to me, he's talking there about geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music, which Plato wants people to go on studying into old age. But Epicurus says, no, the thing that you need to, you should learn those, get a basic grasp of those things in boyhood. But the thing that you need to study both in boyhood and in old age, as he says very clearly in the letter to Monoicius, is philosophy, and specifically a philosophy that is going to bring you true health and lead to the best life. So my answer to the thing is both. The thing that you should learn as a boy, you should learn geometry and music and mathematics, but you should also start down the path of learning how to live, which Epicurus has quite a lot of advice on.
Yeah, Martin, I'm really glad you asked that, because I don't think I'd ever looked at it from that perspective before, but I can see how somebody might be questioning exactly what you're questioning here. And I would agree with what Joshua said. I believe this sentence is the very last sentence before he turns it back over to Cicero again. So I've always, when I've read this sentence, applied it to basically everything that Torquatus has been saying before, which in my mind adds up to the issue of just what is the goal of life and how do you incorporate philosophy into it, and all of these issues that we've been talking about throughout the entire section of Torquatus. So I do not think he's limiting that to talking about having a correct understanding of music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. That would be part of it. But I've always interpreted that what he's saying is that these subjects, the subject of the nature of the universe and pleasure being the goal of life, and these basic issues of how to think, are not all that complex, and that we ought to be able to study them even when we're children and grasp a basic understanding of the fact that there's no supernatural gods, the fact that there's no life after death, the fact that not virtue and not idealism is the way to live your life, but just like every other living thing is, by reference to pleasure and pain and an intelligent pursuit of a happy life with that as a framework. So I've always considered that this does apply to the whole of Epicurus's position, because you are going to go on studying throughout all of your life, basically things like astronomy and even getting pleasure out of magic square games and arithmetic and digging tunnels for aqueducts using geometry. You're going to use those all of your life. So maybe the key word is learned here. When I see learned there in both of these translations, I kind of came to the conclusion that he meant that you really did come to an understanding of the basic concept early in life. And you'll never find ways to exhaust your application of even music and geometry and mathematics. But I do think you can learn the basic approach to life relatively early.
Certainly there's a lot of detail to fill in, as you mentioned science, and there's all of that, but it's been 2,300 years and still no evidence of the supernatural. It's been 2,300 years and we're no closer to finding the edge of the universe. So there's it doesn't all hold up necessarily, but the basic architecture of his philosophy covers almost everything that is worth knowing for human life, particularly as it relates to the health of the mind and to the pursuit of pleasure. And I do think that really he has covered almost all of it. Yeah, that's my answer.
Well, see, that's where I don't think that you and I are very far apart, because when you talk about the letter to Vinicius suggesting that everybody should study philosophy at every age of life, I think what he's saying is that what he's presenting in the letter to Vinicius is the answer about what is the goal of life. If you want to say what is the greatest good, these issues that seem to be the ultimate issues of philosophy. Yes, you're going to continue to study them your whole life, but the basic answers to those questions he's presenting as having largely reached a conclusion about. So you can say that you've learned them. Go ahead, Jasper.
He's presenting it that way, but the point he makes at the end of the letter to Menoikeus is it's not enough just to learn it. He says, study on these and the like matters by yourself and with friends like yourself day and night, and you will never fall into confusion. So that's the problem. People, Lucretius says it in his the beginning of his poem. He says, he's speaking to Memmius, I couldn't remember the guy's name, but he says that in spite of the length I'm going to explain this to you, someday or other you will be tempted to fall away because you'll hear the ranting of priests or the specious arguments of other philosophers. But just remember these things and study them day and night, and you will remember, and you won't, as Epicurus says in the letter to Menoikeus, you won't fall into confusion. And the result of that, the result of studying both in youth and in old age, the result of studying day and night is that by not falling into confusion over these matters, you will begin to live like a god among men, because surely no one lives a mortal life who lives among immortal blessing.
Mark, you're the one who raised the question. This is a great question to kind of conclude on. Have you learned your ethics lessons, Martin, that you needed to learn? Or do you have additional ethics lessons that you need to learn about the goal of life?
Actually, many of these things concerning ethics, I'm way beyond of learning that stuff. It's just refining my opinion on this. So, but there is no teacher for me to teach me something what I have to learn by heart or stuff like that.
Joshua, what are you thinking?
I think that it really doesn't matter how well you learn it. How many times, this happens quite a lot on the forum, where even, I will say something that does not, at a fundamental level, does not accord with the basic philosophy of Epicurus. For example, I'll say something like, friendship is the highest good. But then there's this whole problem of, are there different levels of good or different levels of pleasure and all that? I think that continual study, even of the basic issues, is really the key thing. And you're supposed to do it your whole life long.
It's almost like a matter of keeping yourself in tune or something like that. You don't ever come to rest. Your atoms are constantly moving. You're constantly getting older. You're constantly changing. You're not ever a point of rest where you're finished until you die. Basically, atoms disperse. So I do agree with you for sure that you're going to continue to study the things that we're talking about and refine your understanding and reinforce what you've concluded. Maybe this goes back into the issue of Frances Wright and her observation theories as well. But do you ever consider anything to be concluded in philosophy in your own mind? I mean, you're not going back every day and questioning, well, really, maybe there is a supernatural God who gave us virtue and we should follow that. I think at that level, you're not supposed to just constantly, in the Epicurean viewpoint, you're not supposed to have to constantly debate yourself with that question.
Yeah, but at the same time, the symmetry of that is that I don't daily wake up and ask myself whether 1 + 1 still equals 2.
That's true, too. That's right.
So the fundamental outline of astronomy and mathematics and geometry and maybe even music, the architecture of those disciplines doesn't really change much day to day either.
So if we parse this last sentence, the real issue we're talking about, it sounds like, is he's focusing on those persons that are uninstructed who think that subjects which it is disgraceful to a boy not to have learned are to be learned through life into old age. So is he really pointing at Epicurus, or is he's pointing at the other people in that section, right? So what is he saying these other people are saying?
Okay, so what's going on here is other people are saying about Epicurus, he thinks that music and poetry and art and math and geometry and astronomy, these things are all worthless. They're not worthwhile. That's the view that other philosophers had of Epicurus, right? Mm-hmm. And Torquatus is saying, Epicurus is not uneducated. He has a basic grasp of all those subjects. It's the other people who are uninstructed who think that we need to go on studying those subjects into slow old age. That's the way I read it.
This is fascinating to me. I'm really glad that, Martin, you brought up that question, because I think this is something I'll be interested to hear what other people have to say on the forum as well. I always thought that was a little bit more clear than it is now that I'm actually talking about it. And that's an example of needing to continue to study at any phase of life and learn more about it.
Right.
Any concluding thoughts? I think we've learned a lot and done a lot of good by going through the Torquatus material in general. And after today, we'll go to the letter to Herodotus, and we'll start that next week, and we'll talk about that on the forum as the week goes on. But any general concluding thoughts on Torquatus in general?
Yeah, my concluding thought is that...
Go ahead, Joshua.
Sorry. We start with Martin. Go to Martin.
Martin?
Yeah, so this time I have a closing statement. So thanks to Joshua for answering the question I raised here. So I fully agree with your explanation on this one. So I think we reached a good conclusion on this.
Yes. All right, now Joshua.
Okay, my concluding thought is that, this was not something I had read really prior to us doing this project. I got an audiobook and I was trying to listen to it, but it was quite difficult. I mentioned before we started recording, I think people are going to have some questions as to why we didn't get to the letters of Epicurus earlier in the discussion. But really, having come to the end of the Torquatus material, it's so clear that there's a lot of really great sources out there. And even if they weren't written by Epicurus himself, they're worth going through. And this is something that's going to be worth reading, I think, time and again. So the struggle for me is going to be coming up with the discipline to actually read it time and again. But it has been, I think, an absolute pleasure going through it.
I very much agree. And of course, first of all, I really appreciate your taking the time to have read the entire material. And we've got that out there on the internet available for people who want to listen to the full Torquatus section from beginning to end, which is probably the best way to absorb it all, is to just listen directly without all of our commentary. But now they have both. They have our commentary and our discussion, and they have the full original read version that Joshua has recorded and be easy to find if you just come to EpicureanFriends.com. So we started out in the podcast with Lucretius, which is probably the most detailed presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us. And then we boomeranged to the other extreme of using Torquatus as a very high-level summary of the ethical positions, which, of course, there are letters of Epicurus on as well. But the Torquatus material here is in some ways more clear and more sweeping a presentation of Epicurean ethics than even the letter to Menicius to some degree. So we've gone from extreme detail up to a very high-level outline in this Torquatus material. And where we'll go next is to sort of the middle ground of going through Epicurus's own letters, which is a summary of what Lucretius had presented in more detail. This letter to Herodotus in particular goes back into more of the physics, but it also includes some epistemological issues about how to think and how to reason and the nature of knowledge that are real important, especially at the beginning. So next week, we'll go to the letter to Herodotus. So thank you for being here today, and we'll talk next week.
All right.
Okay. Very good. Bye.